On the outskirts of New Orleans, the old lighthouse stood in silent defiance against the river fog that rolled off the Mississippi. Its paint had long peeled, revealing streaks of weathered wood beneath, and the once bright lantern at its peak had not glimmered for decades. Local residents whispered of strange lights that occasionally danced along the top of the tower, and of footsteps echoing through empty halls long after the sun had set. Harold, a young photographer driven by curiosity and an instinct for the unseen, felt compelled to explore the derelict structure. As the nights grew darker and the fog thickened, he approached the lighthouse with cautious determination. Each creaking step of the wooden walkway under his boots seemed amplified, mingling with the soft murmur of the river against the shore. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of the river. Harold's camera hung from his neck, capturing shadows that seemed to move independently of their source, silhouettes that lingered a moment too long before vanishing into the gloom. Inside, the spiral staircase wound upward in a narrow, suffocating embrace. The walls bore the marks of years of neglect, splintered beams, rusting nails, and graffiti etched by those who had dared to trespass before him. Occasionally, he caught a fleeting glimpse of movement at the edge of his vision. A figure, hunched and indistinct, appeared to trace the same steps he took, vanishing whenever he tried to confront it directly. The presence felt neither hostile nor benign. It was a residue of memory, a tether to something long lost. Harold spent hours exploring the lighthouse's interior, noting the quiet spaces where the shadows pooled and the sudden chill that washed over him without warning. He felt a connection to the river beyond, as if the currents themselves carried the echoes of those who had perished there. Each beam of his flashlight revealed fragments of a story written in absence. Rusted oil lamps, worn floorboards, and tattered rope that had once anchored boats now long gone. The weight of unseen eyes pressed upon him, and he understood that the lighthouse was not merely a structure, but a vessel of remembrance, keeping alive the tragedies of the past. Night after night, Harold returned, drawn by a mixture of fear and fascination. The silhouette of the old keeper appeared more clearly with each visit, lingering near the cracked walls of the tower, sometimes just beyond the railing, sometimes at the foot of the stairs. The figure seemed intent on repeating a task that had no end, a ritual bound to the memory of lives claimed by the river. Harold documented everything, yet he knew that no photograph could capture the essence of the place, the weight of the silence, or the feeling that the past and present overlapped in the narrow confines of the lighthouse. Through these nights of quiet observation, Harold sensed that the lighthouse itself breathed with the memory of sorrow and survival. The river's fog wrapped around the tower like a shroud, and the light that had once guided sailors now illuminated only the remnants of loss. Each shadow, each step, each echo seemed to draw him deeper into a history that was at once invisible and undeniable. By the time he finally descended the spiral staircase at dawn, he felt irrevocably changed, carrying with him the unspoken stories of the lighthouse and the river it had watched over for generations. Along the edge of the waterfront, a figure in white appeared with an unsettling regularity. Thomas, a young engineer who had recently moved into a modest apartment overlooking the river, first noticed her one fog-laden evening. She emerged from the mist as if borne on the currents themselves, gliding without a sound, her gown trailing lightly behind her like the last trace of a memory. Each appearance brought with it a sudden drop in temperature, the kind of chill that seeped into the bones and left the air trembling with anticipation. Thomas became captivated by her presence, observing her silently from his window night after night. She never strayed onto the streets or mingled with the occasional late wanderer. Instead, she stayed close to the water's edge, her movements deliberate, her gaze fixed on the flowing river. The lights of the docks reflected off the rippling surface, illuminating her figure in ghostly highlights, and Thomas felt an inexplicable pull, a desire to understand the sorrow she carried. In his quiet investigation, Thomas learned the story that had been whispered among the older residents of the neighborhood. Many years before, the daughter of a wealthy merchant had drowned in the very waters he now overlooked. Her death had been sudden and tragic, a cruel accident that had left the city mourning and her family in permanent grief. Over time, her name had faded from newspapers, her grave unmarked, yet the river seemed unwilling to release her spirit. The Lady in White was said to be her manifestation, wandering the waterfront in eternal vigilance, a sentinel between the living and the waters that had claimed her. Thomas noticed patterns in her appearances. She was most visible when the fog rolled in thick from the river, obscuring the outlines of buildings and muffling distant sounds. When she emerged, the air would grow heavy and cold, and the river seemed to react, its surface trembling with small, restless waves. Locals who had seen her described a similar experience, a warning presence, an omen of danger to those who ventured too close to the water. In that sense, she became a silent guardian, her tragic history transformed into an unseen protection for the community. Night after night, Thomas watched the Lady in White, documenting her presence with careful notes and photographs. He became attuned to the rhythm of her wanderings, noting the subtle variations in her movement, the way she paused at certain points as if observing something invisible. The sight of her became both haunting and oddly comforting, a reminder that some tragedies, though old, could be honored through remembrance. Each evening, when the fog swallowed the waterfront and she emerged once more, Thomas felt the weight of the river's past pressing against the present, a delicate bridge between memory and reality. Through these quiet nights, he began to understand that the Lady in White was more than a spectral figure. She was a living memory of loss, grief, and vigilance. Her presence spoke of the river's dangers and the fragility of life near its edge. And Thomas carried that awareness with him long after the mist had dissipated. The waterfront, once merely a backdrop to his daily routines, had become a place charged with history and unspoken stories, where the living and the departed coexisted in the soft, ghostly glow of moonlight filtered through fog. The abandoned theater loomed at the end of a narrow street, its once grand facade faded and worn by years of neglect. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of varnish that had long since begun to decay. James, a young history student fascinated by the city's hidden past, had ventured there to document its forgotten stories. The theater had been closed for decades, yet as he explored its vast, empty halls, he began to sense that it was far from lifeless. Late at night, sounds of music drifted through the corridors, soft at first, like the tentative notes of a forgotten piano, then swelling into the rich chords of orchestral instruments. Applause echoed faintly, filling the empty auditorium with the ghostly presence of an audience long gone. The old seats creaked as though shifting under unseen weight, and the chandeliers above swayed with imperceptible motion, reflecting dim fragments of moonlight that filtered through broken windows. Each sound was disjointed yet purposeful, carrying a rhythm that hinted at rehearsals and performances suspended in time. As James documented the phenomena, he discovered historical records that told of a young actor who had died during the theater's final reconstruction, a promising talent whose life ended abruptly before the curtain could rise on his debut. Locals had whispered that his spirit had remained, bound to the stage where he had dreamed of applause and recognition. James became aware that the apparitions were not random. The ghost moved with intention, replaying fragments of his lost life in spectral loops. During nights of a strong moon, James noticed a faint silhouette on the main stage. The figure moved gracefully, performing gestures that mirrored rehearsed lines and long-forgotten choreography. The faint echo of an old violin or violin-like instrument drifted from the stage, vibrating through the theater and spilling out into the deserted streets, touching the edges of the city with mournful notes. James realized that the sound carried not only through space, but also through memory, summoning echoes of past performances into the present. Each visit brought a heightened intensity. The music grew louder, more complex, as if unseen musicians had joined the lone ghost actor. The theater became a nexus of energy, a place where the living and the departed converged in silent harmony. Scholars, thrill-seekers, and those curious about the supernatural began to gather discreetly, drawn by stories of flickering lights, moving shadows, and the resonant voice of the old theater that refused to fall silent. James found himself both awed and unsettled. He realized that the theater's power lay not merely in haunting spectacle, but in the persistence of memory, the yearning of a life interrupted, and the indelible mark left on space itself. The walls, the stage, and even the dust seemed to pulse with history, responding to the spirit that lingered within. Every sound, every shadow, every tremor of the chandeliers reminded him that some stories could not be closed, that some voices demanded to be heard long after the final curtain had fallen. Through his meticulous observation, James felt the theater's narrative weave around him, shaping his understanding of loss, ambition, and the spectral endurance of passion. The empty halls became alive in his mind, a living archive of art, desire, and tragedy, where the ghost of the young actor continued to perform for an audience invisible but deeply present, a bridge between the fleeting present and the haunting persistence of the past. In the heart of the French Quarter, a narrow alley wound between centuries-old brick buildings, their facades etched with the stains of time and history. Each week, as twilight surrendered to night, a strange fog began to creep along the cobblestones, thick and luminous, swallowing street lamps in its ethereal haze. It moved with deliberate slowness, curling around corners and seeping into doorways, transforming the familiar streets into a shifting, disorienting labyrinth. Alice, a young journalist fascinated by New Orleans' hidden mysteries, ventured into the alley under the dim light of a waning moon. The air grew heavy and damp as she advanced, carrying the faint scent of decayed leaves, wet brick, and a hint of something undefinable, like centuries of unspoken stories. The fog seemed to react to her presence, curling higher, thickening in places, and revealing fleeting glimpses of figures within its depths. Shadows appeared and vanished, as if the alley itself remembered the lives that had passed through it. There were faint outlines of men and women in period clothing, their faces pale and hollowed by time, moving with the stiffness of those who had known tragedy. Alice felt a pull toward these spectral echoes, as though the alley were a mirror reflecting the collective memory of past catastrophes, fires, floods, and epidemics that had scarred the city and its people. The fog carried their sorrow and urgency, a silent warning whispered in shapes and movement rather than sound. She noticed patterns emerging. The fog always appeared at the same hour, winding its way from one end of the quarter to the other, tracing paths that seemed both arbitrary and deliberate. It lingered around certain buildings longer, as though those walls absorbed and emitted memory, acting as conduits for the past. Alice began documenting these occurrences, noting the way the fog condensed around old signage, windows, and balconies, creating fleeting tableaus of lives interrupted, of moments frozen in time. As she followed its serpentine course, the alley became increasingly disorienting. Distances warped and familiar corners shifted. Sounds were muffled, footsteps echoing strangely, sometimes not matching her own pace. The fog's movement seemed almost sentient, guiding her along specific paths, urging her to notice details: a broken lantern, the rusted railing of a stairwell, the faint trace of a handprint on an old doorframe. Each sight told a fragment of a story that had been lost to time, yet remained inscribed in the city's memory. Alice began to sense that the fog was more than atmospheric phenomenon. It was alive with remembrance, a manifestation of collective consciousness shaped by the suffering and endurance of countless generations. The alley became a living archive, each swirl of mist a paragraph, each shadow a footnote of history. She felt a strange mix of fear and awe, realizing that to walk within the fog was to confront the city's unspoken past, to witness tragedies that had shaped the rhythms and resilience of life in New Orleans. By the time she exited the alley, dawn was breaking over the quarter, the fog receding into the unseen corners from which it had emerged. Alice carried with her the impressions of the night, images of ghostly figures and the lingering weight of history. She understood that the fog was a guardian of memory, a subtle warning to the living that the past remained present, shaping the patterns of life and urging caution, reflection, and respect for what had come before. At the edge of the city park, where the grass met the shadowed line of oak trees, an old carousel had been abandoned for decades. Its paint was faded, the once bright colors dulled by sun, rain, and wind, and the wooden horses were chipped, some missing limbs or ears, their glass eyes clouded with age. On windy nights, the carousel seemed almost alive, the air around it vibrating as if it remembered the laughter and music of long-forgotten days. Mark, a curious teenager drawn to the uncanny, often wandered past the fence that surrounded the carousel. One night, as a cold gust rustled the dead leaves, he heard it, a rhythmic thump, like the pounding of hooves on cobblestones, echoing faintly through the empty park. He strained his eyes, searching for the source, but the carousel stood still, its horses frozen in mid-gallop, their painted mouths frozen in silent cries. Compelled to understand, Mark returned night after night, documenting what he saw and heard. Sometimes the wooden horse at the center of the carousel appeared to shift imperceptibly, leaning forward as if preparing to leap. The wind carried whispers, fragments of music from a calliope long dismantled, and faint laughter that seemed both joyful and mournful. It was as if the carousel itself retained a memory, replaying a scene that had ended in sudden tragedy. Researching local archives, Mark discovered the story of a circus performer who had owned the horse. The man had been a renowned equestrian, famed for daring tricks and graceful displays. During a performance many years ago, an accident had occurred, a catastrophic misstep that had ended both the show and the performer's life. The horse, the centerpiece of his act, had been preserved, left on the carousel as a silent witness to the past. Mark began to sense that the spirit of the performer lingered within the carousel, tethered to the horse that had defined his skill and ambition. The phantom rhythms of hoofbeats were not malevolent, they were repetitions of a performance left incomplete, a dance with mortality frozen in time. The broken horse became a conduit for the performer's unfinished gestures, a reminder of fleeting brilliance interrupted too soon. Nights in the park grew increasingly surreal. The wind, the whispers, the shifting shapes of the carousel stirred a mixture of fear and fascination in Mark. He realized that the carousel existed in a liminal space between memory and reality, a stage where the dead reenacted fragments of their lives. Each creak of wood and gust of air was a signal, a silent plea to witness what had been lost yet refused to vanish entirely. By the time dawn softened the shadows of the park, Mark left with a lingering sense of connection, as though he had glimpsed a story that had persisted long after its author was gone. The broken carousel horse remained frozen in its silent vigil, waiting for nightfall, waiting for the wind to breathe life into the memory of its fallen performer, and for someone like Mark to watch the performance unfold again, unseen by the eyes of the ordinary world. In the heart of an old, overgrown cemetery, where tombstones leaned at impossible angles and moss crept over the edges of marble, a large black cat appeared. Its eyes shone like molten amber in the moonlight, and its fur absorbed the shadows around it, making it seem almost spectral. Locals whispered that the cat was no ordinary animal, but a guardian, a sentinel appointed to watch over the restless dead. Sam, a young writer fascinated by the macabre and the mysterious, began visiting the cemetery night after night. He walked along the winding paths, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves heavy in the air. From the corner of his eye, he often caught glimpses of the cat, perched atop gravestones or slinking silently among the crypts. Its movements were fluid and deliberate, vanishing like smoke whenever he tried to approach. Over time, Sam noticed patterns in its behavior. The cat would appear near freshly disturbed graves and linger where inscriptions spoke of tragedies long past. It seemed attuned to the history buried beneath the soil, moving as if it were tracing the threads of forgotten stories. Sometimes, the wind would carry the faint sound of whispered names, and Sam imagined the cat as a conduit between the living and the dead, listening to the memories that the stones themselves could no longer speak. The more he observed, the more Sam understood that the cat embodied the cemetery's memory. It was a symbol, a living guardian of secrets and sorrow, connecting the present with events that had long since slipped from human recollection. The cat's presence felt protective, a silent warning to those who would disturb what should remain undisturbed, yet also a reminder that history persisted in the spaces between life and death. Nights stretched into weeks, and Sam's fascination deepened. The cat never approached him, yet it allowed him to witness its vigilant patrols, as though acknowledging his respect for the dead. Shadows shifted among the gravestones, and sometimes, fleetingly, Sam could sense figures of the past moving just beyond his vision, drawn by the same guardian that now observed him. The cemetery became a theater of memory, with the black cat at its center, a timeless sentinel bridging centuries of human experience and holding the weight of countless untold stories. By the time the first light of dawn seeped into the cemetery, the cat would slip silently into the darkness, leaving no trace but the memory of its passage. Sam returned home with a strange mixture of awe and reverence, carrying the sense that the cemetery was alive in a way that defied ordinary perception. The cat remained, ever watchful, a shadowy sentinel guarding the secrets of the past and the fragile line between the living and the dead. In the heart of the French Quarter, a small jazz club stood in shadow, its neon sign flickering faintly through the humid night air. Inside, the walls echoed with the stories of decades, of saxophones and trumpets that had once called life into the streets. Lately, the club had been silent in a way that unsettled the neighborhood. Musicians who had once played there vanished without a trace, leaving only instruments abandoned on the stage and sheet music scattered across the floor. Detective Richard, drawn to the mystery by rumors and the quiet desperation of the club's owner, began his investigation with careful observation. He wandered the empty hallways, feeling the vibration of the floors under his feet and the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. Old records lined the shelves, yellowed and cracked with age, and one in particular caught his attention. The label bore no name, only a faint inscription etched into the vinyl, worn but legible enough to suggest a history of both passion and peril. When Richard played the record, the room filled with the haunting sound of jazz, notes twisting and bending in impossible ways, carrying a resonance that seemed to linger long after the music ended. He realized that this was no ordinary recording. It held the echoes of the musicians themselves, a spectral imprint of their final performance. Each night, the sounds drifted from the club into the surrounding streets, heard by those who walked past, though the musicians themselves were never seen. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, hints of figures that blurred and disappeared before the eye could focus. Richard traced the pattern of disappearances and discovered that each musician who vanished had been involved with the cursed record. The longer they played alongside it, the more their presence slipped from the world of the living, their spirits drawn into the haunting melody that had become both bridge and trap. The detective sensed the city itself resonating with the sound, as if the river, the streets, and the buildings had absorbed the song, lending it power to reach across the veil separating life from death. The investigation led him deeper into the club's history, uncovering stories of ambition, jealousy, and the desperate pursuit of musical immortality. The record had been created decades ago in the fevered nights of a forgotten jazz ensemble whose final concert ended in tragedy. Richard understood that the music was a vessel, carrying not just sound, but memory, grief, and unfulfilled longing. The musicians who had disappeared were not gone entirely. They existed in the music, bound to its rhythm and chords, their echoes forming a bridge to the beyond. Night after night, Richard returned, listening to the haunted performance and piecing together the invisible threads connecting past and present. The city outside remained unaware, yet the music continued to pulse through the quarter, a spectral river of melody flowing between the realms. Richard felt the pull of the notes, a subtle tug at the edges of his own reality, and recognized that the record demanded reverence, understanding, and perhaps sacrifice. The missing musicians lingered in the echoes, waiting for the living to acknowledge the cost of their art and the weight of the world that had forgotten them. Along the mist-laden banks of the Mississippi, an apparition of a steamboat appeared only at night, its silhouette glowing faintly through the heavy fog. By day, the river seemed ordinary, calm, and indifferent. Yet locals whispered of bright lanterns swinging on the ghostly vessel and the steady churning of its steam engine that carried a rhythm impossible to ignore. Tourists passing along the riverfront reported sudden flashes of light and the deep, resonant whistle of a boat that vanished before they could approach, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. Edward, a marine biologist drawn by curiosity and the insistence of strange sightings, arrived on the river's edge with instruments and notebooks, determined to document the phenomenon. He watched through the night, eyes straining to discern detail amid the drifting fog, noting how the water shimmered unnaturally where the boat appeared. With each observation, Edward began to recognize patterns in the vessel's movements, as though it followed a preordained course known only to the spirits aboard. Historical records revealed a steamboat that had sunk decades ago under stormy conditions, a vessel that had carried passengers and cargo into tragedy. Edward realized that the apparition was not merely a trick of light or fog, but a spectral reflection of that fateful journey, replaying itself across the divide between life and death. Figures could be glimpsed on the deck, shadowy forms frozen in gestures of fear and labor, their faces obscured yet brimming with silent stories of desperation. The sounds of engines and paddles were not echoes, but imprints of energy, resonating across the river, bending the present to meet the past. Night after night, Edward observed the ghostly steamboat, noting the subtle ways the water responded. Currents stiffened, mists gathered into swirling shapes, and the air thickened with a sense of unresolved passage. He came to understand that the spirits aboard sought closure, striving to complete a journey interrupted by catastrophe, and that their presence reminded the living of the fragile boundary separating memory from reality. The vessel moved with solemn purpose, carrying both sorrow and history, each appearance a whisper from the past, reaching forward to those who dared to watch. Edward felt a growing connection to the steamboat, a link forged through attention and acknowledgement. The night became a vessel itself, bridging the modern riverfront with the tragedy buried beneath its waters. He realized that the ghost steamboat was more than a haunting. It was a symbol of memory, a reminder of lives interrupted, and of the way the past lingers, insisting to be seen, heard, and understood. The steamboat's lights faded only with the dawn, leaving Edward on the riverbank with the weight of unseen history pressing against the present, a silent testament to the persistent pulse of the past. In the narrow streets of the Marine Quarter, shadows began to take on a life of their own, moving independently yet mimicking the gestures of passers-by with an eerie delay. The flickering gas lamps cast long, wavering forms across cobblestones, and the ordinary rhythms of evening activity were interrupted by the silent, creeping presence of these spectral shapes. Victoria, a student with a passion for urban photography, wandered the streets at dusk, her camera clicking as she documented the familiar buildings in the fading light. She noticed the distortions first as subtle elongations of shadow, then as fully realized figures that seemed to lag behind their living counterparts, stepping through alleys and around corners in a rhythm unbound by the present moment. As Victoria continued her nightly observations, she discovered patterns in the shadows' movements. Each one seemed to trace a fragment of history, replaying the lives of residents long gone, their stories frozen in the streets where they had once walked. She recognized gestures of sorrow, sudden recoils of fear, even hurried strides that suggested escape from unseen danger. The shadows did not merely imitate the living, they reflected the echoes of tragedy, disease, misfortune, and acts of violence that had left permanent marks on the quarter. Victoria felt a growing tension in the air, a sense of the past pressing insistently against the present. The shadows appeared at precise moments, as though timed to coincide with Victoria's approach or the steps of anyone passing through the quarter, suggesting awareness or intention. She realized that the apparitions were warnings, cautioning against repeating mistakes of those who had come before. Each shutter click of her camera seemed to capture not just an image, but a fragment of lingering memory, embedding it within the grain of her photographs and tethering her consciousness to the quarter's spectral history. The longer she observed, the heavier the atmosphere became. Time seemed to bend around the shadows. Minutes stretched and contracted as the silhouettes repeated their gestures, their presence a living memory of the community's unresolved grief. Victoria walked slowly, careful not to startle them, feeling the weight of stories that had been silenced too soon, and recognizing that the shadows were both a mirror and a teacher. They conveyed lessons about caution, empathy, and the consequences of neglect, reaching through the veil of the present to impart the urgency of remembrance. By the end of the night, Victoria understood that the Marine Quarter was alive in ways unseen, inhabited not only by its current residents, but by the layered experiences of countless generations. The shadows receded only with the coming dawn, dissolving into the alleys and doorways, leaving Victoria with the heavy knowledge that the past lingered quietly, ever watchful, and that those who walked the streets could not escape its gaze. Her photographs became a record of this liminal space, a bridge between lives remembered and lives still being lived, a reminder that the echoes of history could not be ignored. In the depths of the night, when the streets of New Orleans were nearly empty and the river fog settled thick over the alleys, a strange carnival appeared without warning. Lanterns glowed with a dim, flickering light, casting fractured shadows that seemed to shift and sway independently. Only a few witnesses ever saw it, and among them was Julian, a photographer drawn to the city's hidden layers. He wandered the streets just past midnight, camera in hand, when the first hints of movement caught his eye. Figures appeared at the edges of his vision, blurred and semi-transparent, dressed in costumes of forgotten colors and patterns, their outlines shimmering as though not fully part of the waking world. Julian followed the procession cautiously, noting the ghostly musicians whose instruments produced music that was hauntingly beautiful and faintly discordant. Masked dancers floated across the cobblestones, their feet gliding just above the ground, and the sense of caramel, smoke, and night-blooming flowers mingled with the heavy mist. The carnival moved in loops through streets Julian thought he knew, revealing hidden courtyards and passageways that seemed to exist only for this spectral event. Each movement of the dancers and musicians conveyed a story of lives interrupted, of celebrations never taken, of joy lost to fate or circumstance. As Julian captured the scenes on film, he began to sense the carnival's deeper meaning. It was not merely a spectacle, but a gathering of souls who had departed the world without the chance to revel in its pleasures. The figures were caught between moments, yearning to express the happiness they had been denied, their existence anchored to this singular hour when the living could sometimes perceive them. Julian felt the weight of their presence, a mixture of sorrow and exuberance that pressed gently against his awareness, making time feel both suspended and accelerated. The carnival did not last long. By the first hint of dawn, the music softened to silence. The dancers' forms dissolved into the mist, and the lanterns flickered out, leaving only the faint echoes of laughter and the memory of movement that refused to stay captured fully in photographs. Julian understood that the city itself preserved these apparitions, holding them in a delicate balance between life and death, ensuring that even those who had passed without celebration could exist, if only briefly, in the realm of experience. The photographs he later developed bore traces of shimmer and motion, fragments of joy and grief interwoven, a reminder that the boundaries between the living and the departed were thinner than most believed, and that memory and imagination could summon the forgotten to walk once more among the streets. Beneath the streets of New Orleans, hidden from the casual observer, a labyrinth of ancient canals wound in intricate patterns, some submerged and forgotten, others partially visible in the moonlight. Streams of unusual light rippled across the water's surface, reflecting shapes that did not belong to the present. Lee, an architect fascinated by the city's buried history, ventured into the network, drawn by rumors of illusions and vanished explorers. The water glimmered with a silvery glow that shifted with every step, creating a sense that the walls themselves were alive, breathing, and reshaping. As Lee navigated the canals, he noticed the reflections of structures that no longer existed above ground. Broken bridges, collapsed warehouses, narrow alleys that had long disappeared. Each reflection seemed precise yet impossible, a reconstruction of the city as it had been decades or centuries before. The further he traveled, the more disorienting it became. Paths looped in unexpected ways, and the water sometimes mirrored Lee himself, though his reflection moved slightly out of sync, as if replaying an older version of his journey. He realized that every choice, every step, could trigger a memory embedded in the labyrinth. Memories not just of himself, but of those who had walked these streets long ago, their lives, tragedies, and fleeting joys interwoven into the current of the canals. Time lost its usual measure. Moments stretched and compressed, and Lee often paused to distinguish reality from reflection. Occasionally, shadows drifted across the water, humanoid yet faint, vanishing when approached. He understood that the labyrinth was not merely physical, but a manifestation of collective memory, a living map of the city's past intertwined with the present. The channels forced him to confront histories that were both beautiful and devastating, the layers of human experience overlapping like the water and light, impossible to separate. The carnival did not last long. By the first hint of dawn, the music softened to silence, the dancers' forms dissolved into the mist, and the lanterns flickered out, leaving only the faint echoes of laughter and the memory of movement that refused to stay captured fully in photographs. Julian understood that the city itself preserved these apparitions, holding them in a delicate balance between life and death, ensuring that even those who had passed without celebration could exist, if only briefly, in the realm of experience. The photographs he later developed bore traces of shimmer and motion, fragments of joy and grief interwoven, a reminder that the boundaries between the living and the departed were thinner than most believed, and that memory and imagination could summon the forgotten to walk once more among the streets. Ghost Street, usually quiet and narrow, had taken on an uncanny vitality that night. Strange lights flickered along the pavement and in the windows of abandoned buildings, pulsing with a rhythm that did not match the city's normal heartbeat. Emma and Daniel, a young couple drawn by both curiosity and unease, walked cautiously along the street, feeling the air thicken with a presence that was both alive and spectral. The usual sounds of New Orleans, distant horns, the murmur of the river, and the occasional footsteps were replaced by whispers, faint music, and the echo of movement from unseen sources. As they ventured further, phenomena from the city's legends seemed to converge. The flickering silhouette of the lady in white appeared in a doorway, her presence as ethereal and sorrowful as the stories had claimed. From the shadowed corners, the faint strains of jazz, reminiscent of the vanished musicians, drifted and wound through the street like smoke. Faint, ghostly figures danced along the sidewalks, their forms half light and half shadow, recreating the nocturnal carnival that had haunted the imagination of a few witnesses over the years. The broken carousel horse from the old park seemed to echo faint clops across the cobblestones, while glimpses of the canal labyrinth shimmered in puddles that reflected the street in impossible ways. Emma and Daniel realized that Ghost Street had become a vessel for the city's memory, a nexus where all spectral phenomena, each tied to human experience, tragedy, or joy, manifested simultaneously. Each sound, flicker of light, and shadow carried the weight of history, and the couple felt as though they were moving through both the past and present at once. It was overwhelming, disorienting, and beautiful. The street seemed to breathe, expand, and contract in time with the collective memory of those who had lived, suffered, and celebrated in New Orleans. As the night drew toward dawn, the manifestations gradually receded. Lights dimmed, shadows settled, and the echoes of music, laughter, and footsteps faded into silence. Emma and Daniel stood alone in the empty street, feeling the lingering hum of what had been. Ghost Street had returned to its ordinary appearance, but the knowledge of its deeper reality remained. The past had not vanished, it lingered, embedded in every corner, every reflection, and every shadow, a reminder that the city's history was not merely recorded in books or plaques, but alive, preserved in the atmosphere and memory of those willing to witness it. They left with the understanding that, while the night's marvels had ended, the secrets and stories of Ghost Street would endure, woven into the fabric of the city, invisible yet eternally present.